My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. You know the drill by now, another week, another Ren and Stimpy game. In the future, we'd see Nickelodeon release one game for a bunch of platforms all at the same time, but back in the 90s there was a different approach. Rather than create similar games for all of the existing consoles, Nickelodeon were tasking different developers to go wild on one specific console. The result of this approach means today we're breaking new ground. I'm reviewing a Sega Game Gear game. The Game Gear was released in 1990 and at the time it was quite impressive. For one, it had a backlit screen. It took Nintendo until the Game Boy Advance SP to address this issue. It was also pretty impressive from a technical standpoint, boasting vastly superior performance to the original Game Boy. These advantages came with a bunch of negatives though. Because of technology limitations at the time, packing all this into a handheld made the console rather large and paired itself with a rather short battery life. Your Game Gear needed 6 AA batteries and could only run for 3 to 5 hours. In comparison, the Game Boy needed just 4 AA batteries for 30 hours of life. Unfortunately, the Game Boy was a juggernaut, leaving the Game Gear to languish. The library of games was small, and they would only end up selling around 11 million units before it was discontinued. But hey, Sega announced the Game Gear Micro this year, so if you've ever wanted to play an extremely tiny version of one of the most underperforming handheld consoles, now's your chance. The first and only Nickelodeon game to be released on the Game Gear was Quest for the Shaven Yak, starring Ren and his simp. This would be the last exclusive game released for a Sega console. The Real Monsters game would also come to the Genesis, however, it's basically the exact same as the Super Nintendo version. Released in November of 1993 for the Game Gear, this was the third of 4 Ren and Stimpy games released in that calendar year. Funnily enough, this game also ended up getting a Master System release in 1995, but exclusively for Brazil. The team tasked with taking the Nickelodeon smash hit to Sega's handheld were the developers Real-Time Associates. They were founded in 1986 by a group of ex-Mattel Electronics employees to create games for the Intellivision, and from what I can tell, they might still be around. A lot of the info I found on them seems to imply they're still operating, and I can even find info stating their last released game was in 2014. Even weirder is they developed a game based on Bill Clinton's cat. Titled Socks the Cat Rocks the Hill, it was developed for the Super Nintendo, but never saw the light of day. This is because the publisher for the game went bankrupt right at the tail end of development. It was so late in the process that review copies had already been sent out. Sitting lost for a couple of decades, eventually in 2018 the ROM was released to the public, so now everybody can play through the thrilling adventure of Bill Clinton's pussy. Throughout their history, Real-Time Associates developed games based on Marvel, Star Wars, and the NBA. They also made a couple of other Nick games too. They made Rugrats Search for Reptar and the Real Monsters game I mentioned earlier. Critically, I wasn't able to dig up much old review info for this game. Apparently the reviewer for GamePro heavily praised the music and visuals, but that's about all I could find. The quality of Ren and Stimpy games have been a bit of a roller coaster so far, so who knows what to expect here. But before I get stuck into the review, I just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for supporting this channel. Because of my reviews for Battle Through Time, Nick Kart Races, and Power Trip, as well as a huge shout out from Pan Pizza, the audience for my videos has exploded in the past few months. The channel has grown at a rate quicker than I could have ever imagined, and it's all thanks to you extremely loyal viewers. I've got a lot of big plans for the channel, so I hope you all stick around into 2021 and beyond. But now, on with the review. While not exactly based on a singular Ren and Stimpy episode, the titular Shaven Yak was a popular recurring character throughout the show. It makes sense that they eventually leveraged that into a video game. The story here is that Ren and Stimpy find one of the Shaven Yak's hooves, so set out on an epic journey to return it. For this epic adventure, you're given the choice of picking either of the characters for the first time ever. Previously, we've seen separate levels for the two, or controlled them simultaneously. Before each level, and after every death, you're given the option to pick as who you want to play as. Because of this, Ren and Stimpy are functionally the same character. Their physical characteristics like speed and jump height are identical, and they both deal out the same ranged attacks. Despite being able to have a preference for who you use, you'll still be playing as both characters. You have 6 lives to play with 3 of them being given to Ren and the other 3 to Stimpy. Once you run out of lives with one of them, you're forced to control the other. The gameplay and controls are super simple here. Not to say that the other Ren and Stimpy games have been complex, but they've all seemed to add at least one little quirk into the mix. Here you're simply running, jumping, using your ranged attack, and trying to get to the end of the stage in a typical left to right fashion. Similar to Stimpy's Invention, the previous Sega game, your health is tied to a health bar rather than a set number of hits you're able to take. Initially, I thought the counter at the top indicated you could only take 3 hits, but when you're damaged, you'll see that certain chunks are taken out. If you fall prey to a weaker enemy, it might only do a quarter or a half of damage. If you run afoul of a scarier enemy, like a boss for instance, it'll probably wipe off a bigger chunk. This works pretty well and does help make the challenge much more reasonable than it otherwise would have been. Naturally, you'll find health pickups scattered around levels to replenish this. To my surprise, the health you start off with isn't actually your maximum health. You can extend your health past this initial range, and while you probably won't be doing that naturally very often, there are items that will instantly take you to Ren and Stimpy's full health potential. In the first level there are an abundance of health pickups, but these soon dry up to the point where it's basically the polar opposite. This then swings back around again, with the final levels featuring plenty of items. I think I would have much preferred a consistent scattering of health items throughout the game. The way they did it made the start and end of the game significantly easier compared to the middle. Also, apparently there is a shaving cream item that will grant you a 1-up, but this is incredibly rare. I say apparently because I certainly didn't see this item myself and only heard about it when looking up guides to the game. It doesn't really matter too much anyway, because losing all your lives in this game isn't too much of a setback. The trend at the time, which I absolutely despise, was to kick you back to the very first level, a holdover from the arcade days. Thankfully, Quest for the Shaven Yak just sends you back to the start of whatever level you were on. That's a quick way to win my heart. A significant portion of your time in this game will be spent shooting down enemies. This is much more of an action platformer rather than a straight up test of your jumping skills. Stimpy's attack is his classic hairball maneuver, which a number of you have corrected me on. I still like to think of it as a spitball though. Ren's attack sees him throwing toothbrushes, which I believe is a reference to the Season 2 episode Ren's Toothache. These are both pretty simple. You press the attack button and a projectile goes flying forwards. About 3/4 of the way through, I also discovered you could send the attack flying diagonally. Diagonally. To add a little spice to the combat, the developers also included a bunch of unique weapons you could discover during levels. This reminded me a fair bit of the different weapons you could find in Dexter's Lab Robot Rampage. Some of the weapons include Toast, this zappy remote, or Bubbles. Each of them is still a projectile attack, but the pattern and area they cover are drastically different. In general, whether it was my basic attack or these weapons, combat was such a hassle. Lining up enemies, particularly flying enemies or enemies perched on a higher platform, is a massive pain. It's so awkward to aim your attack, and it doesn't help that the game is constantly placing enemies of awkward sizes in the most awkward places. Most of the time the damage I took felt like it wasn't because I didn't react quick enough, but it was because I was unable to do advanced physics equations in my head to hit what should be pretty basic targets. Not helping is that the majority of weapons you pick up are garbage. I have a particular hatred for the bubble weapon, which shoots out at an angle. This is perfect for killing birds, but god-awful in pretty much every other situation. Most of the weapons outside of the zappy remote that functions basically the same as your regular attack are more hassle than they're worth. The one saving grace of these weapons is that they grant indefinite invincibility. Once you take a hit, you lose access to the weapon, but you don't have your health affected, so that was nice. Playing through the levels, I could really feel myself starting to enjoy Quest for the Shaven Yak, but I was constantly being frustrated by the combat. I think maybe it needed a melee attack too. The Game Gear only had 2 buttons though, so that probably wasn't feasible. I haven't mentioned the platforming yet, which is sort of strange for a platformer, right? Well, the platforming really isn't all that notable. It's not terrible, but it's not amazing, and playing this you'll actually find that platforming isn't that important. There are pretty much no difficult jumps or tricky traversal sections here. Honestly, most of the platforming difficulty comes from the awful combat. Because it can be damn near impossible to hit the broadside of a barn with your attacks, you often end up doing a panic dance routine of jumps to try and avoid enemies. This does cause some issues as the mediocre platforming controls are clearly not designed for the player to be doing twitch-based actions. Again, if they had managed to fine-tune the combat, this wouldn't have been an issue. The one really difficult platforming section was the snowball avalanche at the very end. I hated this with every fibre of my being. Most levels are laid out very basic and don't give you too many opportunities to fail because you miss time to jump. Levels might as well be entirely flat for what it's worth. At the end of every level, Ren or Stimpy will need to fight a boss. These are horribly unimaginative for Ren and Stimpy. On your journey, you'll fight iconic characters such as Dog, Snake, Eel, Sexy Lumberjack, and Yeti. Like the platforming, it's pretty bland. Also, they're fucking awful for the most part. The big issue that persists across basically all of them is that the attack patterns they use are a little too hard to pick up on. You need at least a handful of attempts before you're able to properly identify what they're doing and when they're going to do it. Once you pick it up, the boss battles are a walk in the park, but the process of getting there is a little cumbersome. Another persistent issue comes from what I suspect is a limitation of being on the Game Gear. The screen is so zoomed in, which isn't a problem in the normal levels, but in boss battles it really hurts the experience. Having such little on-screen room means you often can't tell what a boss is doing and will inevitably lead to a bunch of deaths. Even worse is that you can only damage a boss if they're on screen. Fights would have been so much easier if this wasn't the case, and it's honestly a little unfair. How come Sexy Lumberjack can attack me when he's not on screen, but my toothbrushes don't damage him even though I know he's there? I could definitely see a fine-tuned home console version of these fights being really fun, but in their current state, while also held back by the limitations of the Game Gear, it's not fun. Speaking of the Game Gear, remember when I said it was more powerful than the Game Boy? I honestly don't think Quest for the Shaven Yak is too superior from Space Cadet Adventures from a technical standpoint. I think it looks marginally better and it's in full colour, which helps, but environmental design felt so bland. In comparison, I thought Space Cadet Adventures had pretty detailed environments for the hardware. The design of everything is just sort of bland. That's a word I keep coming back to, and I guess it's an apt description for this game as a whole. Levels feel so samey in terms of layout and their design. I wouldn't go as far to call them terrible or anything, but they aren't exciting to look at. There were some cute animations that would play when you unpause the game, which I really liked. Did get slightly annoying when this happened every time though. After unpausing the game for the 10th time, I was sick of seeing Stimpy with his coffee. The music here is extremely forgettable, which is rather impressive because the game only has like 3 unique tracks. You know your music is 100% milquetoast when it's not even able to be annoyingly repetitive. Having mostly shit on Quest for the Shaven Yak, I have to say this is still the best handheld Ren and Stimpy game. There are aspects where Space Cadet Adventures or the Game Boy version of Vidiots are superior, but as an overall package, this Game Gear title wins out. If you were a Sega kid and a big Ren and Stimpy fan, you were certainly winning out compared to the Nintendo fans. Once you get accustomed to many of the quirks of how Quest for the Shaven Yak functions, it's almost an enjoyable game. Unfortunately, it just has far too many issues to be a certified recommendation from me. There's a lot worse in the genre and the Ren and Stimpy franchise, but you won't be missing much if you skip it. Next time I'll be taking a look at Ren and Stimpy Buckaroos. That game was released both on the NES and SNES, with each version differing quite significantly, as far as I can tell, so I'll most likely be covering both games in that video. To make sure you catch that review, and all of my future Nickelodeon video game history episodes, make sure you're subscribed.